you for being here wherever you are. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to present this panel called Beat Generation Goddess Ruth Weiss Considered or hopefully reconsidered for some of you or the majority of you. I'm also very thankful to BAAS for allowing us the space and the time to be here to talk about this poet, playwright, filmmaker, artist, Ruth Weiss. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the format of the session. We're going to have 8 speakers doing flash presentations. So they're going to be very short presentations, and then we'll have the discussion at the end. So the idea is to have to offer enough points of entrance into Weiss's work so as to be able to have a conversation afterwards. So we'll also be answering questions from the audience if there are any questions. So let's get to it. So Ruth Weiss, I'm not going to be again talking a lot about Ruth because I actually want people in this panel to talk about her and her work, but just very briefly to sketch her life for those of you who don't know her. She was born, as you can see, in 1928, born in Germany, but to Austrian Jewish family. And she spent her early years pretty much on the road, as we can say in this big world. So we can talk about Berlin, Vienna, then the Netherlands, United States. Then she went to study in Switzerland and then finally relocated in the US in the late 40s. Finally moving on to San Francisco in the early 50s. So she has authored almost 20 poetry collections. She's written plays, acted in several films, and also written and directed a film herself. In addition to exhibiting her watercolor haiku paintings, she also pioneered the genre jazz and poetry, which she actually performed to pretty much until her death in 2020, so last year. Right, so speakers today, you can see the dream team there. These are the speakers who are going to be presenting today. And again, because we have an hour and a half for 8 speakers, I'm not going to be wasting time introducing the short bios, but I am going to tell you, though, that all of these wonderful people are part of the EBSN, which is the European Beat Studies Network. So if you want to know more about the EBSN, and also if you want to check out everyone's bio, you can go to the website, and if you click on about EBSN, you can click on membership, and you see all of the bios. I'm also taking this opportunity to encourage you to become a member. So if you're interested in this, the only thing you need to do is send an email. So that's easy to do and very cheap. So if you want to be part of us, simply send an email. I'm also, since I'm here, I'm also want to encourage you to participate in the conference we're having later this year. This is in October. It's going to be, again, an online conference because of COVID. It's called The Present and Future of Beat Studies. So if you scan that code right there, it'll take you to the website for the conference. Okay, what else? There's one thing also that this wonderful group of people have in common, and that is that in addition to being part of the EBSN, they're also part of this, which is Ruth Weiss, Beat Poetry, Jazz, and Art, which is a book that Thomas Antonic, who's going to be also participating in this panel, and I co-edited, and that is going to be published hopefully by the end of 2021, so this year. And we're very happy and very excited to have been able to put this book out and to have these contributors, who are also speaking in this session, be part of this book, which is the first collection on Ruth Weiss. So again, we're very happy to be able to talk about her here in the book and to be able to present this here in this conference. So without further ado, because I don't want to waste more time, I'm going to be introducing or simply sending the mic over to Chad Weidner, who's going to be the first presenter. So Chad, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay, I'm sharing my screen. I think you can see it. Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So Ruth Weiss is receiving increasing attention, and more study can bring new environmental understanding to more what I consider outlying beat affiliated writers and the variety of their arts. Now, one main aim of my paper is to highlight an internationally oriented female beat writer, Ruth Weiss, thus challenging some of the common views about the composition of the beat generation. The secondary goal is to bring beat works into further dialogue with environmental discourse currently. Essentially, I propose that Weiss's work explores transitory spaces as well as the negated material body. Thus, my paper provides a green perspective on Ruth Weiss, who remains an eclectic polyglot, a transnational, cross-century beat wanderer. Now, next slide, if it lets me. For the sake of brevity, I will only discuss one of the poems here, just to give you an idea of what I'm writing about in my paper. Desert Journal was published in 1977, and the collection is interwoven with drawings evocative of prehistoric petroglyphs, like you see here, of the Thunderbird and other prehistoric dreamlike images that dot the rugged landscape of the west of America, harkening back to an unknown and unfamiliar culture which developed profound understanding of the intrinsic value of nature and of cultural representations of nature. But Desert Journal is much more than simple reverence to more primitivist cultures. The collection also harkens back to the historical avant-garde. Desert Journal resembles a sort of vision quest or solitary mission of scope and great importance to forming one's own identity. Think about the Western Christian tradition, journeying out to the desert to find oneself. And I'd like you to consider the following excerpt. Sour sauce, marinate this life. Without seeming cause, Weiss has lost its sharp, sharp has lost its spice, Weiss has lost its sharp, harp has lost its string, string has lost its wing, harp has lost its spring, spring has lost its sing, wing has lost its bird, bird has lost its turd, Weiss has lost its spice, and turd on the third day, hope as spice the night, night has lost its fight, to be the one unknown, want to be, has sown the seed, the need. And I find this really interesting because to me, I see compelling examples of repetition, rhyme, off rhyme, and especially language play that to me recalls the work of Kerouac, Ginsberg, and also Burroughs. Linguistic play is evident in Third Day through repetition of rhyme, sounds, and of the earthy and scatological language. The playful engagement with the vulgar also parallels Weidner, Dada rejection, and subversion of mainstream language and discourse. Another example from Desert Journal speaks to both transitory spaces and the negated material body. And I'd like you to think about the following. A void cannot be avoided. This is printed in all caps, and at first, this might suggest solemnity to invoke a message of deep caution. Further reflection suggests more intriguing links to environmental thinking. When thinking about the purpose of such a powerfully ideological reading of a void cannot be avoided, one cannot help but consider Buddhist embrace of the void, of the emptiness. And when contemplating the ecological significance of the idea of the void in the context of literature, William Ruckert warns, history is not a nightmare, but a corpse, a wasteland, a void, a world in which there are no sanctuaries, a sterile and impotent self, an ontological cemetery, a catalog of dead visions and dreams, revolution, transcendence, immersion, cognition, and ironic resignation. We might best simply accept the evolutionary dead end ahead and live in the moment, which I think speaks to the larger project. There's an accepted, I'm just gonna move ahead. There's an accepted theory called heat death of the universe, which suggests that once the capacity of the universe to generate new galaxy fails, a point of total heat death will occur, which means not only the absolute extinction of all creatures everywhere, but the end of all movement everywhere, leading to a forever frozen void. While a deeply disturbing prospect that frightens and troubles us, this knowledge that people exist in a temporary, ephemeral, transitory space also provides opportunities to reconsider human time on this earth. By acknowledging the limited time that we have, people have the chance to imbue their lives with meaning. And this is what Heidegger also believed separated humans from animals. If humans are doomed, and if we know it, then perhaps it is simply best to accept the void cannot be avoided. Interesting also is that acceptance of the void appears throughout the wider work of the Beat generation. You think of Ginsberg and the Buddhist void. You think about Kerouac looking introspectively. You think of Burroughs and his discussion in the Western lands. So I think her work fits in the larger Beat project. Furthermore, Weiss interrupts mainstream language and expectations of what poetry is and is supposed to do. Her work recalls Burroughs' writing as well as Dada and Surrealist fracturing of conventional reader expectations. It manifests itself in Weiss's writing and the rhetorical strategies of language play, which, while evident in her work, also resists a straightforward ecological reading. It's really interesting. It seems that no clear environmental message generally seems possible, but Weiss shares the same trick here as Burroughs, the active countering of reader expectations and the associated hegemonic thinking about the form and function of literature. In the context of Weiss's wider corpus, one could say that the combination of urgent subversion of mainstream discourse and the environmental content of much of her work together pair an interesting combination, highlight the emptiness of consumer culture in the second half of the 20th century, but at the same time speaks to the larger Beat pursuit of ecstasy. Read in this way, Weiss's art can be seen as occupying a transitory space between performance art, the Beat generation, and the historical avant-garde. At the same time, her work speaks to more ghostly questions, including the negated material body, or at least the potential of humans to escape their physical limitations through art, which revises the long-standing mind versus body debates. By investigating transitory spaces of language, cultural identity, literature, and poetry, Weiss participates in a kind of disembodied phototropism, which is the tendency of plants and other microscopic organisms to favorably respond to sunlight or to move towards or grow towards the light. I've got a really great example of this. We've got an apple tree planted on the northern side of our house in the north of Belgium, and it's in a really terrible position, but it's over the years, it's kind of reached around the side of the house so it can reach towards the light. So in this way, it can be said that Weiss speaks directly to the larger Beat pursuit of blessed enlightenment, civic responsibility, and community. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. All right, so we're moving on to the second speaker, Ben Hill, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks so much, Estíbaliz, for organizing this panel. It's really great to kind of be part of this again, and also it's wonderful to represent the EBSN again at this, which I think is our first panel as an organization. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, really great to hear Chad's talk as well. I mean, we haven't had the chance to see the other essays in the book of the essay collection on Weiss, and it's amazing how many kind of connections and cross connections there are there. So, okay, I'm going to get straight into it. So my chapter explores Ruth Weiss's poetry's post and transnational outlook, particularly her ingrained resistance to power and her poetry's clarity and liminality. In particular, her poetry's dissonant contrapuntal relationship to the frequently employed improvised jazz accompaniment that she uses, which marks, I feel, a barbarism in Adorno's sense of the term, with word and sound that sets her work as a site of resistance to a simple construction of aesthetics in the Beat context. Now, you can see this in Weiss's name itself, which she kept all lowercase as an act of defiance. As she states, and I quote, "Every time I sign my name, it is a revolutionary act. My way of standing up to the control of the law and order, Germans in the 30s, whose demand for control led to World War II and Nazis murdering millions of people. My name is a form of resistance," end quote. This defiance was initially nurtured by mainstream cinema rather than underground poetry, interestingly. So I'll skip to the next slide if I can. Yeah. So, so Weiss saw this Joseph Losey anti-war movie, The Boy with Green Hair. It's actually one of my favorite movies, but from 1948. And she decided to, as you can see, dye her hair green in solidarity. And this is a poetic act in itself as symbol of peace. Losey himself, the director, was later blacklisted in 1951 during the Red Scare after refusing to testify at the HUAC hearings, and was later forced to make his movies in Europe, and specifically London. So globalized contextual narratives such as these are central to Paul Giles' approach to American literature. Now, he argues that we cannot ignore global contexts by promoting the virtues of particular kinds of identity politics as they emerge from the confines of the nation state. Instead, there should be a comparison between an American framework and what lies outside it, thereby highlighting the specific elements that reconstitute transnational networks in different ways. And this is in part why my essay disregards specifically US contexts and concerns and considers Weiss in a more, again, in a term I use advisedly, post-national frame. It is impossible, I feel, to overlook Weiss's uniqueness and marginality, even in a beat context. Though she had considered her work part of a forgotten history of beat women, this has to some extent been rectified, as Chad mentioned, with increasing recognition of her work and that of other female beat writers. Although Weiss's friendship with a pre-on-the-road Jack Kerouac has overshadowed the reception of her work, her role in nurturing his interest in jazz poetry and haiku has been overlooked. On the Road itself marks the beat movement as about precisely that, movement. Yet Weiss was hitchhiking around America long before its publication. As Jimmy Fazzino notes in his book, World Beats, with echoes of Edward Said, for beat writers, a distance from home is what opens up a space for all sorts of unexpected connections and crossings to arise in their work, end quote. Weiss was already away from home when she arrived in the United States, and this gives her work an intellectual advantage. It is always already grounded in a rootlessness and worldliness, again to use Said's term, that has enabled her to see and resist the locatedness of power. Move to the next slide here. Weiss embodies a transnational identity and poetics that is both in harmony with and a rejection of existing beat poetics. Indeed, the androcentrism and silencing of women that occurs in On the Road is reversed by Weiss in Gallery of Women, the collection in 1959, a meditation on and celebration of her female poet friends. The achievement of Gallery of Women is to recenter the feminine. The poems are all portraits of women, with Weiss also including her surrealist-inspired visual portraits of some of them in the middle of the book. It is evident that these poems of women effectively and deliberately seek to portray them directly without any reference to men. Now, Weiss's transgressive, androgynous, and transnational presence in the beat canon is also often missed. In transnational terms, Weiss joins the US initially as a refugee or exile in a dichotomous position, a rootlessness with a sense of home and acceptance while also rejecting US hegemonic ideologies through her poetic promotion of peace and cohesion. Underlining this position is her enthusiasm for jazz poetry. Her poetic style has similarities with the jazz-inflected prose of Kerouac's On the Road, yet Weiss maintains a much stricter politics of individual resistance to conformity. This commitment recalls Weiss's friend, the black beat poet Bob Kaufman, who often set his poetry to jazz rhythms. Kaufman's lived commitment to poetry as performance is noted in Weiss's references to him in her work. And in terms of race, Weiss herself felt perfectly comfortable embedded in Black culture, as she explains, "My parents put me into this children's home in Harlem, and I was the only white girl in my class, and I couldn't even speak English. And so I've always been at home with their language and their music and most of their jazz musicians," end quote. This comfort is a rejection of the fascism she escaped and is free of the platitudes of On the Road. While Weiss's influences have been cited by Nancy Grace as Yeatsian automatism and Zarian Dadaism, pointing to a transnational range, she also has been linked to the Romantic and Buddhist belief in first thought is best thought. Given the attention paid to the interconnectivity between Weiss's work and jazz, it is ironic that silence, or rather blank space, is central to a written poetry. As you can see in the slide, the large blank spaces on the page of her poem 41 Dragon Steps actually contrasts with the babbling lyricism of her preceding poetry in the collection One More Step West is the Sea. And this is from her debut collection, Steps, from 1958. In music, as you probably know, a step is the difference in pitch between two consecutive notes of a musical scale. So again, Weiss is setting her work as a liminality, forming a contrapuntal relationship between different points and also different media forms, I think, as some of the other papers will look at. So the silence marks not only a marginality of women's voices, but also transience, marked at the end of One More Step is West is the Sea. Again, this is something that Chad's paper was about, by the comment that I've lived here 5 years and only met 2 who were born here. The poem ends with a powerfully silent ellipsis, its power denoting the powerlessness of the individual. Again, this sort of irony here, power and powerlessness. The 41 dragon steps are themselves haiku-like impressionistic fragments, many just 2 or 3 lines per page. These clearly sinospheric elements point to the Eastern influences on beat writers. But again, Weiss's collection is divided into 2, divided between the urban city-based images of One More Step West is the Sea, juxtaposed by the Eastern imagery and haiku form of 41 dragon steps. They point, I feel, towards a post-national formulation, embracing both elements. Indeed, just skip to the next slide here. Weiss's contrapuntal splitting and attack on the rhythmic flow of speech has much in common with the textual violence of Burroughs and Geissen's later cut-up method, and the attacks of free jazz as well, which were influential on that method. Cocky with Earth paintings, you can see on the slide from Gallery of Women, also references this dissonance with structural violence and sexuality. I won't read the poem, it's more for you to see how it looks on the page. So these grammatical breaks in the poem feel like cuts, and they're emphasized by the short lines, while the offset section makes it unclear whether the reader should read across or down or insert text in the gap. The open possibilities of this poem mark a point of charged significance that resists semantic explanation. And the influence of haiku is significant due to the importance of cutting, or kiru. This is captured through the juxtaposition of 2 images or ideas with a cutting word, kareji, in between. Cutting is a reflection of Weiss's barbarism of word, but is also a metaphor for Weiss's politics. Gender, race, national identity, all marked by a triangularity of others pushing towards a oneness reflected in Weiss's poetry, painting, performance, and film. I'll conclude here just by saying Weiss's life and work can be seen as a resistance to fixed labels, conventions, and ultimately power. Her work is finely carved with a clear poetic focus, while her preferred context, performance, provides a space that aids understanding of her work. And also beat texts more generally through its many liminalities, transnational and transcultural crossings. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It's nice to start seeing these connections, and we're going to see more connections as we hear from more speakers. So Polina, floor is yours. Polina Mackay.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just going to say that as the other 2 were speaking, I could just see so many connections. It's just such a great idea to have this workshop, actually. So thank you so much for organizing this, Thomas and Estíbaliz. Right, I'm not going to share my screen. So I'm just going to talk. I'm just going to do a summary of what I said in my paper for the anthology that Estíbaliz and Thomas put together, and hopefully we can have a few questions at the end. So in my article for this anthology, I tried to move away from the beat connection a little bit, and I look at Weiss's work in relation to what I call the poetics of the desert. By which I mean, quite simply, poems that are centrally concerned with the desert as a symbol, using desert imagery such as the sand or the burning sun to talk about the present moment. I concentrate on one of Weiss's most extensive works, which is Desert Journal, as you've heard before. And I have to say, I loved working on this book. This is the first time I looked at this in a serious way. Because this book is many things at the same time, I think, and this is what makes it so fascinating. First, it is a kind of journal as it charts the speaker's daily routines, journal style. over a period of 40 days, numbering each day as it goes along and giving us an impressionistic account of the speaker's day-to-day experience. These journal entries then quickly develop into elaborate meditations on religion, politics, culture, poetry, or the arts. At the same time, they're clearly poems, as you've heard before. They are structured as poems, and there's deliberate use of features of poetry, such as figurative language and alliteration. As the book consists of 40 poems covering 40 days, it also clearly invites a theological reading, and in particular, the story of Moses and the Israelites who spent 40 years wandering in the desert, a story that is covered in Exodus. And in addition, that of Jesus, who spent 40 days meditating in the Judean desert. Weiss invites this theological reading of the book right from the start, in the prologue poem, where she uses images of fire and clouds set against the desert landscape. And again, this is imagery borrowed from Exodus to set the scene of the book. The story of Moses and his people becomes an important context then in Desert Journal, in that it also helps to determine Weiss's book as one about community and nation building. There are many poems in the collection that illustrate this purpose, poems that use pronouns such as we, you, or one to express a sense of collective identity, poems with recurrent images of community building rituals such as group dancing, or poems that use the image of people walking through the desert like herds as their focus. At the same time, Weiss's collection retells the story of Christ, who walked through the desert alone for 40 days. As we know, this narrative is known as the temptation of Christ, and it tells the story of Jesus' spiritual battle to resist temptation before returning to Galilee to take up his ministry. In her appropriation of this narrative, Weiss makes use of the image of a solitary traveler through the desert in order to give a personal or subjective dimension to the story of Moses and the people of Israel. Thus, parts of the story of a nation are told in short confessional poems. Fittingly, Weiss writes the moment Christ is freed from Satan and sin and finds some form of release in the desert as a moment of both personal and collective freedom. So we read, for instance, "Let go sin, all of me," apologies, emails from work, "part of me, none of me," end quote. Weiss's use of the stories of Moses and Christ in the desert suggests that the desert in the book is first and foremost a symbol of spiritual significance. Let me just kill the work email. Of course, Weiss is not the first poet to treat the desert as a symbol. There is a long tradition of poetry in English that uses imagery associated with the desert to explore such subjects as the nature of reality versus dream, themes of alienation and unknowingness, or ideas about individual growth through treacherous journeys. See, for instance, Wordsworth's Book 5 of the Prelude, Stephen Crane's Desert Poems, Josephine Miles' poem Desert, Harriet Monroe's A Garden in the Desert, or Mina Loy's Mexican Desert. Interestingly, this tradition of treating the desert as a poetic symbol has continued into contemporary American poetry, and in particular, poems written in the last couple of decades in response to America's wars beyond the American border. Sandra Osborne writes in her 2004 poem entitled Iraqi Desert, for example, that the images of the desert mediated through the news coverage of the Iraq War create, quote, sandy TV screens so bleak and all alone, unquote. And Elise Fenton's Baghdad poem entitled Word from the Front juxtaposes the desert landscape with, quote, the verdant green neck of Baghdad's bottled glass night and the cratered ground, unquote. Similarly, Weiss populates her poems with elaborate desert imagery that speaks to a range of human conditions and emotions. However, Weiss focuses on the idea of transformation. This is evident first in the gender journey that her speaker goes through. At first, the speaker is a clearly androgynous voice, not just speaking to both men and women, but speaking as both man and woman. But by the end of the book, the speaker begins to speak more clearly as a female voice. Although Weiss's decision to privilege the woman's voice may be linked to the advances of feminist thinking among female writers throughout the 1970s, it is also an attempt to write against the narrative of the universal experience, where everyone experiences spirituality, sexuality, or their gender in similar ways. Thus, Weiss also includes in the poems recurrent elements which are distinctly American. A prime example are her references to Native American cultures and languages, with the speaker announcing towards the beginning of the collection, quote, "I am in Indian territory," and quote, "with the main features of the desert landscape renamed as Indian sun," while the Indianness of the place seems to be reshaping the poetic mind. The poet writes, quote, "She feels her Indian strong, but the Indian is not pure, so she's not sure what is her right and what is her wrong," unquote. Here the speaker rightly feels out of step with the native landscape of America, being as she's of white European origin and an integral part of the settler colonial mindset. The uncertainty Weiss expresses here around the issue of the ownership of the American land, so she's not sure, she says, what is her right, determines her treatment of America in Desert Journal as a symbol with a fraught history around the issue of who owns the land that makes up America. What is more, I think Weiss's nod to the idea of a wrong being done in the same poem reframes the history of this land and the history of land ownership to a narrative of injustice. So I hope I've given you a summary of some of the major ideas in Weiss's Desert Journal as I see them. I think in all of these interconnected layers, Weiss writes the desert as a manifestation of a series of never-ending imaginings. So ultimately, I think the desert for Weiss in this book captures the creativity, the need for searching, the inconsistency of a very interesting poetic mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Polina. Okay, so I'm going to continue a little bit with what Polina was saying, because I'm going to talk about gender and identity in Ruth Weiss. Just very briefly sketch what I've done in my chapter in the book. You can see my screen now, right? All right, so I'll jump right to it. So throughout her body of work, Ruth Weiss shows a preoccupation with themes of identity construction and expression, as Polina was also mentioning, which often stem from opposition of normative gender dichotomies that situate women and men in battle. An example can be found in this poem where man and woman in the poem, this is the poem Blue in Green, find themselves struggling to find a balance between their own identity and self-expression and the categories they're placed into. We are of man and woman, and having named us, both will still use us as battlefield. We scream to find our balance. Now, Weiss herself, who only truly felt comfortable with the label of the poet, or better yet, the jazz poet, constructs throughout her body of work a poetic stance which systematically disrupts and dissolves gender constructs and which, as Mary Carden has noted, quote, critiques and reformulates models of identity based in binary opposition, end of quote. Now, to briefly sketch this disruption and dissolution of gender, in this presentation, I'll concentrate on the thematic as well as the stylistic choices through which Weiss, in a way, complicates gender. So I'll begin by painting a picture for you. So when the 20-something short green-haired Ruth Weiss hitchhiked her way into San Francisco in 1952, she seems to have been instantly assimilated by the counterculture. As if organically assumed by the bohemian fabric of the city, there was little doubt that Weiss would live outside conventions of gender normativity. My last ride drops me on Broadway on Columbus. North Beach says, "This is where you belong, right on." Now, in keeping with the ease of these lines, Weiss rarely uses her work to denounce or expose gender disparities or an unbalanced access to art and poetry. Unlike poets like Anne Wollman, Diane di Prima, or Joan Kiger, who have dealt more overtly with gender issues inside and outside artistic circles, Weiss has favored a poetic stance in which gender of the speaker or the subject in her poems either assumes a secondary position or is increasingly diluted until barely being represented. In any case, her body of work is not ignorant of the gender dichotomies that prevail even within bohemian circles. And sometimes this translates in a kind of tension and opposition that is ultimately resolved. For instance, tension between the sexes is clearly represented in he and she, which are the two main characters of Weiss's The Brink, and this is the film she directed in 1961. In one of the first scenes of the film, he and she sit across each other in a cafeteria, while a mirror doubles up their image as if anticipating the film's preoccupation with issues of identity, individuality, and subordination between the sexes. It is in this context that the narrator directly questions the roles he and she are to fulfill. Are you my day, my sun? Am I to walk with you? Am I to talk to you? Now, these questions, as the film progresses, become more and more relevant for both he and she, as the couple's recurrent refusal of, as well as longing for, connection leads them to question their individuality and their self-expression in association with the other. Hence, the mirroring of the line, go to the roundhouse, he can corner you there, with go to sea, she can corner you there, foregrounds the poet's insistence on gender balance or equality. As such, Weiss uses the archetypical he and she, which are embodiments of the gender divide the poet often contests in her work, not to denounce women's subordination to a kind of patriarchal overruling power, but to stress the dangers embedded in the labels attached to both men and women. In the film, it is not until some of these tensions are resolved that he and she are finally free to create a space in which they can be both themselves individually and with one another. This peaceful reconciliation of the sexes happens not coincidentally at the margins of society, in the debris and ruin where the couple can begin to build up a new relationship, a new way of interacting with each other. So as shown by these examples, Weiss's poetry shows an understanding of the complex and often oppressive gender discourses that affect both women and men, and which, I think more interestingly for a poet, may negatively affect their creativity. Perhaps to free language from the body it channels through, this thematic interest in Ruth Weiss's work often turns into a degenderized poetics, in which, as it happens in Anne Wollman's creative feminifesto, the poet's body is an extension of energy. So using language as the debris through which he and she rebuild their connection in the brink, Weiss often uses wordplay, syntax, and juxtaposition of images to symbolically break down the barriers and the categories that keep men and women, as well as poetry itself, contained. So perhaps Weiss's most ambitious examination of the poetic eye is, again, Desert Journal. This is a book that Nancy Grace, for instance, has described the speaker's voice in these poems as, quote, depersonalized, desexualized, degendered, and dehistoricized voice. So much of this process of de-ing the poem, or the voice of the speaker, has to do with freeing language by eliminating the external elements of control. In this case, being the personal, sexual, and gender poetic voice, the first one to go. So transform into this kangaroo bird that is either sex or both, as Polina was also mentioning in the first poem, the speaker loses authority and therefore gains the creative freedom to question the form of language itself. And is it a or the, or is it singular, plural? Who are you to say how s should be placed? If? Who are you to say a or the? Now the empty and yet ever-changing desert becomes the perfect scenario for the poet to expand the poetic vision beyond the different mechanisms of control that, as we have seen before, affect both genders in Ruth Weiss's poetry. It is in the recognition and the elevation of the complexities and contradictions of the multi-singular that we see in the 21st day that the speaker in Desert Journal manages to use language beyond social, aesthetic, and linguistic constraints. So in a nutshell, in Weiss's poetry, we can see how language is understood in its complexity. It is used with caution as it can participate in both the perpetuation as well as the contestation or elimination of the categories that men and women are placed into. And that's the end of my thing. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Thomas. Thomas, Antonic, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you. Yeah, my chapter in the book provides an overview on the scope of the Ruth Weiss papers. And the poet began selling parts of her papers to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley in 1992. Some of you have seen this collection, or at least parts of it. And it contains mostly manuscripts of published and unpublished poetry from the poet's later years, broadsides produced between the early 70s and approximately 2010, as well as documents of her performances and public appearances, such as flyers, posters, newspaper clips, interviews, etc. What is interesting is that most of the manuscripts are written in a silver pencil on various types of colored paper, and I'm sharing my screen to show you 3 examples. Do you see that now? No.
Not yet. Okay, now that works.
Okay. So 3 examples of this. These are poems written around 2007. And when I started my biography project on Weiss in 2016, the poet let me work in her private archive, and it turned out that the manuscripts of poetry at the Bancroft Library are only a small selection of her works. And so I'm talking about approximately 1,000 unpublished poems that were still like at her home in Albion that were not to be found in Berkeley. And also a few prose pieces, which are unusual for Weiss. And the earliest texts are the earliest text there dates from 1947 and was written in Neuchâtel, where Weiss stayed at a boarding school while her father worked as an accountant for the US Army Civilian Corps in the occupied Germany. And this manuscript or typescript looks like this. And this text could serve as one example of the importance of Ruth Weiss's papers for future analysis, also of her better known works. In brief, it is a short prose piece of half a page written on a typewriter describing the landscape of the Swiss Voralpen, which is a part of the Western Alps. Despite its brevity, the text already contains elements that become characteristic of the poet's later work. So she has written that when she was 19 years old. And the landscape here is seen as a living organism, just like, for example, in the Desert in Desert Journal. The Alps, quote, laugh in a fierce way, yet in their wrinkles of stone and snow, they nestle and cuddle little velvet flowers, Edelweiss, end quote. Although it is prose, the rhythm and the repetition of similar sounds and syllables have the effect of echoing later poetry, in which, as here, colors also play a central role. Quote, in the summer in the Voralps, there's such greenness and such blueness and such windness and such wildness and such stillness, end quote. Yeah, I stop with an analysis here because there is no time at all, almost. So here's another early unpublished poem. Rhythm of the bob, gone notes, cool, cool, blow, press, blow, I've got eyes, solid, daddy-o poke me, bloodshot, in stupid glaze, up in Highland, blow, press, blow. And below there it says poems written for but not included in Spasms, which was a poetry collection she planned in the 50s but never got published. And this poem was found in a folder entitled 1958 to 1952 Chicago, New York, New Orleans, which means it was written before Ruth Weiss's arrival in San Francisco in 1952. Not only does this testify to the heavy influence of jazz already present in this early creative phase, but it can also be regarded as beat poetry par excellence, with its rhythmic drive, spareness, and affinity to bebop long before Weiss met Jack Kerouac and the other beats in San Francisco. It is even conceivable that this could have been the poem that Ernest Alexander tore out of Weiss's typewriter in her room at the Art Circle in Chicago in 1949 and urged her to perform in front of an audience while the musicians on stage spontaneously started to play, thus creating jazz and poetry. All right, you will find more such examples in my essay. Apart from all these manuscripts, there are about 300 magazines, journals, anthologies, and newspapers from 1950 to 2019 in the private archive of Ruth Weiss that contain poetry of her, most of it not to be found in her books. I have a picture here, like how this, some pictures of her archive. Yeah, and all these will be listed in a complete bibliography of Ruth Weiss's published works that I compiled with Paul Pechman, and that will round up the volume. In addition, there are many unpublished video and audio recordings of performances in the collection, among them over 30 reel-to-reel tapes, the earliest of which is a reading together with Anne McKeever from 1958, etc. So there's a huge amount of materials for future research on Weiss, beat women, and the beat generation in general. And this material is about to go to the Bancroft Library as well, where it will be available to the public, although the process of sorting and cataloging will probably take some years. During which nobody will have access to it, unfortunately. But yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you also for sharing these pictures with us. I mean, I love to see all these manuscripts, so thank you.
Yeah.
So next, Stephanie Pointl, whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you, Estíbaliz. Yeah, so I'm also going to also discover some parallels with some of the previous papers. So for example, with Ben, there are some parallels I've noticed, but I'm actually going to take a closer look at the different routes and movements in Weiss's lives, but also going into the direction of transnationalism. So usually when we think of the beat generation, we first and foremost think of a sense of freedom, a celebration of traveling, exploring the unknown, endlessly hopping trains north and south, or maybe hitchhiking east and west across the American continent. Books like Jack Kerouac's On the Road have shaped the public image of the Beats as a group of freewheeling dropouts, basically. As Deborah Weiss the BAAS observes, they drove their cars not to impress or acquire or to arrive somewhere better, but to escape normative culture and to exist in the moment. Rootlessness was frequently championed as a necessary precondition in the quest for freedom and self-discovery. The journey became an end in itself, a way of arriving at a deeper understanding of oneself and the surrounding world. As a two-time refugee from the Nazis and an uprooted wanderer during much of her life, Ruth Weiss obviously had a rather different and arguably less romanticized attitude towards movement than some of the other Beats. Fleeing the Nazis, first from her birthplace Berlin to Vienna in 1933, and then narrowly to New York City in 1938, traveling solo around post-war Europe during her college days, as we've already heard, hitching rides across the US, eventually settling in San Francisco, going on road trips to Mexico, and decades later, touring European capitals and cities as a celebrated jazz poet. These are only some of the routes on which Weiss's life has taken her. This life, shaped by displacement and both voluntary and involuntary movement, is reflected in an autobiographical poetic work that seeks to navigate the unstable ground between self-chosen bohemian wandering and a search for home. In fact, Weiss attributed her prolonged nomadic existence to a sense of restlessness and a hesitation to have roots again after her escape from Europe. In her writing, movement in various forms is a constant reality, yet it is not necessarily always presented as desirable. In 1952, Weiss hitchhikes to San Francisco, and by 1957, she has established herself as an active member of the artistic scene in San Francisco's North Beach. She performs her poetry to jazz, sells her self-published chapbooks, and publishes poems in the little mimeograph magazine Beatitude. In early published texts, for example, One Where Southwest is the Sea and Compass, she reflects on her cross-continental hitchhiking journey and on a road trip to Mexico. Even though these texts share the exploratory, nonconformist spirit of those of her peers in the beat scene, they also contain subtle allusions to the immigrant perspective of the refugee. The credo of the 1950s is living in the now, a celebration of the present moment. It is also the cool period. And according to beat scholar Ronna C. Johnson, the essence of cool is the appearance of passivity, indifference, and lack of emotion. People don't talk about their past, yet the past is ever present. It haunts her in dreams she won't remember, and in feverish, cough syrup-fueled writing sessions, out of which emerges her refugee story, Single Out. What follows are silent years of crisis, of battling survivor's guilt, and of searching for a sense of identity, of belonging. From 1961 to 1968, she channels this tension between the externally imposed silence and a need to process the traumatic experiences of her childhood into her most ambitious and complex book, Desert Journal, an imaginary journey through a metaphorical desert of the mind in search of solid ground and meaning, in short, of survival. In 1982, she finally finds a place to call home in the small coast town of Albion in Mendocino, California. However, it is only during the early 90s that she begins to come to terms with her past and to creatively process her memories. Her poetic autobiography, I Always Thought You Black, written in 1993, contains fleeting flashbacks to a lost childhood, and I quote, San Francisco, I'm home, a walking city, up and down steps. Vienna, not quite, a pang here and there. Enough, this is not a travelogue, unquote. During her visits to Vienna during the early 2000s, she writes and publishes poems dealing with her experiences as a refugee and the importance of Holocaust remembrance. A particularly poignant example in this regard is the poem Her Number Was Not Called, in which she commemorates her lost relatives and works through her feelings of survivor's guilt. Other texts from this time period, such as, for example, the unpublished poem Her Number Was a Promise Kept, celebrate her returns to Vienna and express her hope to return again and again. As we've seen, Weiss's European roots and relations make her ever stand out among those beat writers who ventured beyond national borders in their lives and works. However, her work has not received much critical attention during the recent boom in transnational beat studies. Ruth Weiss, perhaps more than any of the other beats, embodied a transnational perspective, not only in life, but also in her writing. Her poems contain neither sentimental nostalgia for a lost home in Europe, nor unbridled enthusiasm for the adopted one in the United States. Instead, they convey a voice that moves freely within and between all these places and does not quite allow itself to be tied to any of them. In my chapter in this collection, I consider some of these places and the routes between them to show how their poetic representation can be linked to Weiss's portrayal of transnational connections. Taking impetus from the fields of exile studies and mobility studies, my analysis investigates how her work, as the result of sometimes precarious circumstances, rejects the notion of a self as defined by a nationality, and instead establishes a transnational perspective founded on experiences of movement and the resulting cultural and interpersonal connections, rather than questions of origin. When I interviewed Weiss in 2018, she expressed her deep skepticism of all forms of patriotism and stated that the concept of nationality had no relevance for her, and that she, in fact, considered it to be detrimental to peaceful human coexistence. So finally, here's why I think we should study Ruth Weiss. Weiss's thematic engagement with American and European settings, multilingualism and publication history in different countries make it difficult to classify her work within a single national literary context. A consideration of a body of work such as hers reveals the limitation of traditional frameworks of literary analysis within national boundaries. It challenges us to develop new ways of thinking about literature in an age of unprecedented migration and transcultural interconnectedness. Furthermore, it shows how trans and post-national perspectives can emerge as attempts at coping with the potentially disruptive effects of the experiences of displacement on an individual's identity, which unfortunately are the reality of millions of people today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, I'm very pleased to see these connections coming on together also in this panel. Of course, they're there in the book, so I'm very excited for all of you to read the book finally, hopefully soon. So let's go with our final two speakers who are now going to move into intermediality a bit more. So first, Peggy Pacini, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you. Just would like first to thank you, Estíbaliz, for putting up this session, although I have to say that I really miss our physical meeting, usual physical meeting. So I really hope that Zoom is gonna last. I'm sorry, Chad, for that, but this is, and I also would like to thank you and Thomas for having considered my paper and including it in your volume. So allowing me then to move away from the beat male, more familiar figure I was familiar with. So my paper focuses on, actually my article is focusing on poetry and performance, and here's an idea of what the article was about. So it was a comparative study of 3 poems, Beast, Be a Saint, Speak for Yourself, and 1967, performed by Weiss in 2007 at the Summer of Love 40th anniversary. And the performance is a little bit more than 4 minutes long. These poems were also published in the volume Fool's Journey in 2012 and were also performed in Vienna in 2013 and recorded in the CD Make Waves, released in 2013 too. The same year. So the article examines the nature of her performance, one that was altogether spontaneous and collective in nature, and within the combined framework of her performance practice and of the Beat poet's intimate relationship with the Bay Area Bohemia and counterculture of the 1950s and 60s. It's sought to shed light on 3 aspects. The first one, the essence of Weiss's poetry composing and performing practice. Second, her ability to chisel a performance to the spirit of the era and place celebrated, lending it an essence of its own in the Ikenung of its spontaneous production and building up a ritualistic communal experience. And third aspect, a recognition of Weiss as a longtime West Coast poetry representative and as a Beat female icon. So I was particularly interested in the relationship between Weiss's compositional technique and a performance technique and its reliance on articulatory parameters such as sound, vibration, resonance, as well as on the semantic impact of sound production, that what is called experiential meaning potential, in the framework of this particular performance, which according to me acquires a social and communal function. The performance becoming the area of dialogue where audience and the poet performer are invited to re-establish that communal bond and vision that the very celebration invoked, in fact. So my analysis was largely based on what Bernstein calls the audio text, what the hearers actually hears, or the orality of the poem, and on the contextual factors of this performance, that is participants and spatio-temporal situation. to understanding how this performance released what Weiss defined as, I quote, free-flowing force moving outward from the unconscious toward the self and other, end of quote. I was all the more also interested in the performance of these three poems, the title of which are evocative of the visionary and esoteric experiences, creative energies and insights emerging in the late 1960s. I was all the more interested in them that none of them were written in the era which inspired them. And only the poem 1967 was actually composed for the occasion, for this 40th anniversary. In the context of the performance, the reading of this poem is carefully designed to follow a logical narrative, which is calling for the spirit of 1967 to return. This particular performance was also appealing to me because of a series of contextual factors. That is stage setting, reading conditions, soundscape situation, and acoustic surroundings. Actually, Ruth Weiss had to cope with and comply with, and which constituted a kind of fortuitous situatedness, one compelling her to offer a double performance, namely that of the performance of the poem and the performance of the poem itself. So, a performance which is performing here on her own for this 40th anniversary without musician, which she usually does, but with musician on stage tuning for the next band to perform. Quite amazingly, along her performance, she gradually feels this disruptive presence in her back and synchronizes and tunes with it. Thus showing how spontaneous and collaborative her method in public performance is, and how it contributes also to creating what Grace called a choral voice. I also examined the audience's participation, their reception of the poems and the dialogue Weiss establishes with them. In understanding these poems as a ritualistic experience, the steps of which are defined by each poem, the first one a transformation, the second a test, and the third a return. My focus of interest was how she mobilizes the audience's consciousness and sense of urgency through tone level, body language, and rhythm to enter this ritualistic experience, how she spontaneously resorts to repetitive structures verging on call and responses pattern, how she rhythmically and acoustically plays with vowel sounds, how she creates syncopated patterns, balances rhythm, plays with pace, how she also displaces measures to shift focus of attention on specific words, and thus consequently altering perception and reception of the poem. What is at stake here is how sound memories, in fact, plays in her performance technique, one largely built on her compositional technique, which she draws from what you all have pointed, her intimate relationship with jazz. Word and sound repetition, alteration, syllabic variation, extensions, largely depending on rhythmic patterns or cycle. All these pertaining in developing this communal experience, one that actually happens in the here and now. Eventually, what struck me was how her performance of this poem could be heard as one poem, that these three poems could, in this specific performance, with this specific performance, could be heard as just one poem, or rather, as a ritual, the performer and audience build in the course of these 4 minutes or so. And I almost managed to speak for 8 minutes. This is the first time I managed to do that. So okay.
You have 30 seconds left according to my watch.
Well, that's okay. I was done. So this is just amazing.
Do you want to conclude, or is
no? That was my
okay, good. Okay, thank you so much. Also for timing yourself, which is always good. So thank you. So we're going to move from poetry and performance to poetry and painting. So now we'll go with Frida, our last speaker today.
Hello, from Norway. I'll share my screen first. Let me see. And I'll also time myself. Everybody, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yep. Yeah, we can see it.
Super. Okay, I'll just enlarge it there. Okay, and I'd also like to say thanks to Estíbaliz and Thomas for including me in the book and also this conference. Okay, so I've called my chapter and this short talk today, Ruth, Weiss and Visual Art and the Watercolor Haiku, A Fool's Journey. And I thought we could start by plunging right into Ruth Weiss's studio. And this is a picture I kindly got from Thomas, and I think it tells a lot about her as an artist and her multimodal and interdisciplinary approach to her art. We can see paintings on the walls and all her sketchbooks. There's a piano there, and it tells about this atmosphere of, you know, being a poet, performing to jazz, painting, and also having this relationship with visual artists. She was friends with and collaborated with people such as Madeleine Gleeson, Ayatollah, and Mel Weitzman, Paul Beatty, Sata Marin, etc. And she also spoke about this. I've done plays, she said, I've done paintings, I've done stories, I've done theatre pieces, but I consider myself a poet whose other work, paintings, etc., are simply an extension of the poem. But in my paper and in this chapter that I've written, I've been interested in looking at the connections between Weiss's painted haiku series and the visual art scene in California in these post-war years, and, you know, putting her in this sort of art historical and artist context. And also in my book chapter, I talk about a few artists and a few tendencies in the art of the time. And this is just to show this interdisciplinary and multimodal factor. This is George Herms, who both writes a poem down their circumstances around Larkspur does a hemorrhage. He makes a wood carving and he paints an oil painting, just to show, you know, how this, you know, the multimodal tendency. There's, for instance, Fred Martin, who was a very improvised sketch-like guy who would go around in his car using the steering wheel as an easel and sketch quite like Kerouac did. He was one of the artists who exhibited at the Sixth Gallery during the reading of Howl in '55. Also, beat art is also very performative, as Ruth Weiss art was as well. William Morris here, he made this painting during a happening with singing and dancing, and you can see that they rode car tires across the easel in order to make these traces. Furthermore, Zen was a very, very important part of the visual California art scene as well. This is Arthur Monroe's Untitled sketch, which is very Zen-y. It's like an action painted calligraphy, and it certainly sort of recalls what Michael McClure said about California, the California milieu, that it was that San Francisco was an Asian city, both in temperament and in culture. So this is just to give you some background. And as Thomas Antonic has argued, spontaneity and improvisation have a major function in Weiss poetry. He says that the writing is related to a free improvisational form of jazz, and also similar to this technique of écriture automatique, scrittura automatica. So these features of spontaneity, improvisation, performativity, sketching, etc., are features that we find both in the visual art of the time and in Ruth Weiss's entire work. And in my chapter in this paper, I focused on her painted haiku series, which is called A Fool's Journey, and I'll show you some images from this. It consists of 9 haikus that form a narrative sequence, and it was written way back in the 60s, but then it was painted in 1994, it was published in 2012, recorded in 2017, and republished in 2018. So it has a very long history. And about the haiku, Ruth Weiss herself says that it's a fabulous discipline for making each word succinct, meant cutting out the fat, a perfect exercise for poetry by cutting out the fat and making it bone. And if we look at the sketches themselves and these paintings, we can see that the very same sort of tendencies dominate the visuality of the paintings. You can see that they made their watercolors, and they have a very sort of, how you can say, a simple and clear cut and to the point imagery. When she talks about the wind, she draws the wind. This is the little traveler's book. It's flowing in the wind. You can see it as a concrete symbol flowing in the wind. This is a fireplace. You see the fire, the dance in the flame. The bridge is a bridge, etc. It's a very sort of clear, to the point, and Zen-like imagery. And this is what I discuss in my chapter. I talk about the aesthetical elements or the affordances in this series, and I point to some features like the specific aqueous soft feeling of the watercolor technique. They create this transparent quality that enhances simple quality over her poetic lines. I talk about this naively and simple figurative style, which has connecting to this cut out the fat to the bone aesthetics that she talks about. It's very concrete, it's not abstract, it's the thing. It's also a style in which the most significant feature of the composition is centered and is highlighted. And furthermore, it has these very poignant affinities with Zen painting. As you know, that in Zen, the painted sign, it is the image. And in meditative Zen painting, the artist makes the calligraphic sign or the mandala in an intensely focused moment. One breath, it's one take, one stroke, one breath. And we can see that in Ruth Weiss's imagery as well. It's very, you know, it's what she paints is it's there now. There is no sort of revision in a way. So to conclude, what I say in my chapter is that one can say that these watercolor haikus she makes, they are placed firmly within Beat culture's multimodal aesthetics. And by experimenting with watercolor, she manages to give these poems, in addition to their verbal and musical form, also this concrete visual form. And by adding the visual mode, she extends and she expands the original text in a similar way that George Herms does in this Larkspur series that I showed you initially. Her haikus are written, they're painted, they're performed, thus showing an expansive and playful creativity. And the image on the right there is from the Bonsai series, which is very much sort of a Zen-like image, which you writes quite like a mandala. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida. All right, so we're done, we're finished. That was the 8 super fast flash presentations. So it's actually now time for the audience. If you have any questions, we have about 15 minutes, so we'll be happy to answer some questions from the audience. Or I can also jump in and talk a little bit of spark some kind of discussion, thinking about the shared themes in the presentations. But first, are there any questions from the audience? I'm not sure how the questions work for the audience. Can you turn on your mics and talk, or do you need to write? Not sure how this works.
People can put up their hands or they can type in the chat, whatever anyone would prefer.
Okay, so you can manifest yourself as you want.
Yes.
So any questions? Comments? No, okay, so maybe while you think of questions, maybe we can, because as I've been saying, I'm very impressed with the connections we find in the different presentations here and the other chapters which are also included in the book. So we've dealt with a lot of topics here, and Ruth Weiss is not very known. I mean, a lot of people don't know her work that well. So they might tend to simplify what she's done, and we are seeing here that there's actually a lot of topics that we can talk about in all of her production. So what do you think, and I'm talking to my panelists here, what do you think these different topics tell us about Ruth Weiss's legacy, her role in the Beat generation, the kind of legacy that she has left us? Any thoughts, any ideas?
Can I go?
Sure, sure.
I haven't raised my hand. It's going to go anyway. Well, I think Ruth Weiss, in a way, was seen in such narrow terms for a very long time. You know, I remember when I first came to the Beats as a PhD student, everything I read about Weiss basically was to do with her relationship with Kerouac and the jazz aesthetic and how her language was kind of very jazzy, I suppose, or following certain kind of jazz structures, etc., etc. And actually, that's a very narrow way of looking at her. And I think the book is going to introduce many people to different aspects of Weiss. You know, I mean, I was very, very intrigued by her visual work, the paintings, and how that work can help people read her poetry from different perspectives as well. I thought that was a really interesting kind of way to go. There's also this idea of the kind of identity that she's presenting in her work. I think it's interesting that she starts with these very androgynous voices, and then there's a moment in her career, I think, round about the time that she published Desert Journal, where she starts to speak from kind of more from a female perspective more increasingly, and then goes back towards the very kind of transient kind of idea of self towards the end of her career. And I think it's really interesting to see that movement and see, maybe think a little bit about what was influencing her at the time, and how in her work she was reacting to whatever was going on around her, in the culture around her. I also see a lot of similarities with the work of De Prima as well, especially her early work is quite similar to De Prima's. Then you have these kind of short poems where language is compressed, like it, you know, it happens in poetry, of course, but also you have this kind of excessive repetition of particular words in exactly the same way that De Prima was doing it in her early works, like this kind of bird flies backward and that kind of work in the late 50s. So what am I trying to say? I think there's just so much there, and it's really, really great that this book is coming out now, just a few months after her death, and I'm really excited about the possibility of kind of bringing in new people into this small field and see what happens.
Yeah, sure. Does anyone want to add anything to what Polina said?
Well, the thing that you mentioned, Polina, about this kind of, you enter Ruth Weiss, and then the field is a kind of narrow at the beginning, and then coping with also what Frida was saying, and I know the naively simple narrative style. This is what exactly is for me. I mean, it's not even naive, but it's very simple, and then it's just so puzzling because you don't really know how to deal with that. It's just reaches you deep inside. But then when you come to that, you have so many interpretations, and you can interpret this that way. And then I see that with my, the article I did and about the poem is that if I take them out of this performance, then they are something else too. So it's just that it opened up so many possibilities. And this is, I think, what actually characterizes her. I mean, this is what she is. It's like she's an open field.
Yeah, I think this is also something that was very common to a lot of the presentation here, is this idea of transformation, this idea of expansion, this idea of going beyond of communal experience that in the end leads to transformation. We've talked about the desert as being a space of transformation, but also performance as a space of transformation. Also the poem itself being a space in which you can transform the voice of the poet, but also things. So a space of resistance. All of this is very, very connected. So yeah, and anyone else wants to add to this topic? I was also, yeah, Ben, go ahead.
I can jump in. I just wanted to try and connect Weiss with, I mean, with some of you going to be joining me with a panel at the ACLA over the next few days about beat internationalism. So I want to try and sort of connect what Weiss and what we've been talking about with, I mean, the panel yesterday at BAAS on Trump's America. You had Donald Peace and his, he's done such great work on, the transnational turn. And again, Weiss just seems to me such a kind of a figurehead and such a pointed figure in terms of like thinking about the beat and what it means to be beat, but also that whole transmedia and transnational expansion. And like you say, Estíbaliz, that it's like a betweenness and a liminality, but it's also stretching beyond that and taking things sort of beyond that level. And there are so many of those present in Ruth's work. It's so kind of rich in those elements. It's just sort of so open to these different readings. But I think it's really, I think it's really vital. In fact, I think it's vital for us to be considering this in sort of international contexts right now, when we're facing, that sort of Trump's retreat from cosmopolitanism and this retreat from kind of global politics and the failure of kind of neoliberal politics and this retreat into nationalisms. And how we consider literature and the importance of literature in and culture more widely in creating these narratives and countering these narratives. So yeah, I just think it's really great that we're looking at this subject, but it's just reminding me that it's actually really important and really vital what we're dealing with here. So yeah, I think that's just what I wanted to throw open, really. Sure. See what anyone else thinks about this.
Yeah, I was also thinking about the role of an association such as the EBSN might have to do with something like this. I mean, this idea of the beats no longer being just American, no? And also, this also connects to what Peggy was saying, that the poetry might look simple, but when you look at it, it's so many more things. And unless you open up the points of view from which you see that poetry, there are so many things you miss. And we've had a couple of presentations here that actually talk about Ruth Weiss being this open identity. So yeah, it's also something to consider. I don't know if anyone else here wants to add anything about this on this topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In addition to what Ben just said about things like nationalism and etc. So you, Estíbaliz, are also talking about, I think it was, I'm not sure if you had it in your talk or is it just in your essay, talking about the blurring of the boundaries of gender, race, and sexuality in her works. So my question would be to you, especially, what does it mean to like current developments in like identity politics, for example?
That's a complex question.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think
it's against identity politics, or is it? Yeah.
It's not against identity politics. I don't think so. It's against the idea of having a fixed label. I mean, and we need to understand the context from which Ruth Weiss came from. I mean, a lot of you have been talking about the context, and it's more about this idea of resistance than this idea of negating or avoiding any kind of identity. I don't think it has to do with that, but it has to do certainly with resistance, with using poetry as a weapon to contest oppression in different various spheres. It's somewhat naive, but it does work. I mean, and it is something that is very common to a lot of beat writers, I think. Mm-hmm. This idea of using poetry as a political tool for change, again, for transformation. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to this.
Well, I think Thomas and I will know a bit about this from our work on Burroughs, right? And our interest in Burroughs and his patterns of resistance and his forms of resistance. But yeah, you're quite right in talking about Weiss in that context, I think. Yeah, and again, I think we need to think about Weiss is in terms of, we've talked about her transnational interconnectivities and her placing herself almost, you know, I used the term in my paper post-national, and I use that, as I said, advisedly, because I'm reluctant. Again, I think we're having we have a lot of issues in this, in our field, with defining terms and with defining, you know, what is beat, what is beat internationalism, what is post-national, what is transnational, what do we mean in these contexts? And I think, again, with Weiss, she problematizes that even more. It's becoming even more sort of challenging. Like, where is she from, and you know, how does that play with her work? How does her sort of biography engage with her work? And then how is that beat? And how is that sort of, I've seen written about her beat spirit, and I saw a quotation from Brenda Knight. So I saw this earlier today. Brenda Knight referred to Weiss as E. Cummings with bongos. I think that's a way of kind of reducing Weiss's work to its sort of base element, and how we're often perceived as beat scholars, that we're just looking at people with bongos, right? But we need to sort of defend ourselves and say, well, hang on a minute, what you know, beat is more than just bongos, but what is it? You know, can anyone help fill the gaps there?
No, I mean, I don't think we should, right? This is the point. Like, we shouldn't define it, because I mean, when you do, that's the problem, actually. Or can you define it? I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, so anyone else? We have just a couple of minutes left. So if you wanna finish with a bang, does anyone have like a big statement to conclude?
I have a really quick question for Thomas. So Weiss's archive, is that all sorted, or are there any legal issues there, or is it going to be easily accessible to people and available? Because you know, I mean, it's been a thing in beat studies that archives sometimes are inaccessible, and so I was wondering what the situation is with Weiss's archive.
Well, as I said, the archive will go to the Bancroft Library, so it will be accessible from there. But it will take a couple of years, I guess, until this is the case. And to my knowledge, it's still not known what exactly is going there. So manuscripts and stuff is, of course, clear. But as far as I know, like, her paintings are going to a gallery in Santa Rosa, California, and the Hares are thinking about donating things like her typewriter to the Beat Museum. So that's not clear yet.
Thank you. All right, so I think we need to conclude now, because it's time, and we've already had a warning. So I'd like to end by thanking you all again so much for being part of the book and part of this panel. It's been lovely to see you again, even if it's just virtually. And thank you also to the audience. If you have any questions, any doubts, you can contact us through the EBSN webpage. So again, go there to find more information about us and about what we do. So thank you all so much. Thank you also for the tech support from BAAS, and I'll see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. That was so interesting. Sorry